The silk tore under Aunt Lydia's impatient fingers. "Hold still, Eleanor, unless you mean to arrive before a duke, looking as if poverty itself had dragged at your skirts." The seam had already been let out twice. The gown was 15 years old, softened by time and careful hands, its once silver blue dimmed to the color of evening mist. It had belonged to Eleanor's mother, and until that moment she had not understood that grief could have a texture. It lived in the thinning silk beneath her aunt's hands, in the faint scent of lavender lingering where her mother's shoulders had once warmed the cloth, and in the small frayed place at the left cuff, where she herself, as a child, had clung to her mother's sleeve during a thunderstorm. "I could go in plain wool," Eleanor said quietly. "If His Grace wishes to see what I truly am, that would show him more honestly." Aunt Lydia drew back as if slapped. "What you truly are, my dear, is a girl with no fortune worth naming, no father left to defend you, and no right to be difficult. The Duke of Ashbourne has written. He expects you. If that old promise becomes a marriage, you will thank heaven on your knees for this gown and every stitch in it." Across the room, Lydia's daughter, Arabella, looked up from the mirror where she was fastening pearls at her throat. Bella was 3 years younger than Eleanor, fair in the way painters liked, all cream skin and bright ringlets, and a mouth that had never learned restraint because the world had never asked it to. Her eyes moved over the faded silk with open pity. "It is romantic," she said, "like something from a portrait gallery. If he enjoys relics, you may yet triumph." Eleanor met her own reflection and nearly smiled from sheer weariness. She had her mother's dark hair and solemn grey eyes, her father's straight nose, and a face that grew beautiful only when she forgot herself entirely. In company, she seldom had the luxury. She had learned too early that pretty girls were invited to bloom, while useful girls were invited to endure. The letter from Ashbourne lay folded upon the dressing table. She did not need to read it again to remember every word. His Grace, Adrian St. Clair, Duke of Ashbourne, would be pleased to receive Miss Eleanor Vale at Ashbourne Hall for some weeks, in accordance with the wishes of their late parents. No man could have phrased compulsion more politely. There had been an older promise behind the letter, one spoken long ago beside sickbeds and deathbeds, half family gratitude and half desperate tenderness. The late Duchess of Ashbourne, who had loved Eleanor's mother in girlhood, had once declared that if either of them had a child in need, the other family would provide a home. Later, when Eleanor's father lost first his wife and then his health, the former duke had added a second vow in writing. Should Eleanor ever be left without protection, Ashbourne would not abandon her. If, in time, a union between the two families proved agreeable, it might settle all things with honor. Agreeable. That word had haunted her for a week. Her father had never spoken of it as a bargain. In his final winter, when breath came hard to him and snow whitened the windows of their small rectory, he had only taken Eleanor's hand and said, "If Ashbourne ever sends for you, go with your head high. You were not born for supplication." He had died 3 days later, leaving dignity as his only inheritance. Now the rectory was gone. The small savings vanished into the management of Aunt Lydia's household, and Eleanor had lived for 2 years in borrowed corners, sewing torn cuffs, reading aloud when guests grew tired, and making herself so necessary that no one need remember how unwanted necessity could feel. Then the letter from the Duke had arrived, and all at once everyone remembered that she had a future to be arranged. "If he dislikes me," Eleanor said, more to the mirror than to her aunt, "then perhaps both of us will be relieved." Aunt Lydia gave a sharp laugh. "Men with titles are not relieved by plain girls, Eleanor. They are inconvenienced by them." The words should have hurt. Instead, they only settled more deeply into a truth she already wore like skin. She lowered her chin, while Aunt Lydia pinned the torn seam and tied the blue sash, her mother's sash, newly pressed to disguise the age of it. When it was done, Eleanor touched the sleeve once, just where the fabric was thinnest. She wished absurdly that her mother were there to tell her whether courage and resignation ever felt this much alike. The carriage left before dawn, beneath a sky bruised with rain. Aunt Lydia kissed the air beside Eleanor's cheek, reminded her that gratitude was more becoming than pride, and sent with her a trunk that contained 2 ordinary day dresses, 1 cloak, gloves with worn fingertips, and the silver-blue gown folded between sheets, as if ceremony might disguise humiliation. Bella waved from the doorway with the bright contentment of someone watching another person's uncertainty. By noon, the roads were slick and rutted. By afternoon, the rain had become relentless, drumming on the carriage roof so hard that thought itself seemed to come in frightened little bursts. Eleanor sat with gloved hands folded around her reticule and watched water chase itself down the glass. Somewhere ahead stood Ashbourne Hall, its long avenues and stone terraces, and all the cold grandeur of the life into which she was being summoned, like an unanswered question. She had tried, in the privacy of the jolting carriage, to imagine the Duke. According to Aunt Lydia, he was proud, difficult, and much sought after. According to gossip, he had wealth enough to rescue 3 families and temper enough to frighten 6. According to the county ladies, he had avoided London for 2 seasons, refused at least 1 glittering match, and carried grief as other men carried canes, openly, with a sort of permission from society that women were never granted. Eleanor had not met him. She had only received his letter and the echo of a promise made by the dead. The thought of standing before him, knowing he must measure not merely her face and manners, but her worth as a wife, made her chest tighten until breathing seemed a negotiation. The carriage lurched so violently that she was thrown against the door. A crack sounded beneath them. The driver shouted. Then one side sank, and the world tilted with sickening force. When the carriage stopped at last, half in the road and half in the sucking mud of a ditch, Eleanor's heart was pounding high in her throat. The driver's voice came thinly through the rain. "Axle, miss! Gone clean through! Are we near the house?" Near enough to see its gates if the weather had any mercy. He climbed down with muttered apologies and disappeared into the deluge. Eleanor sat very still for a moment. Then, because stillness had never once saved her from anything, she gathered her skirts, opened the door, and stepped into the rain. Cold struck at once through her boots and hem. Wind snatched at her hood. The road ahead vanished in grey water and bare trees, but through their shuddering branches she caught a glimpse of stone gateposts and wrought iron beyond. Ashbourne. The driver was bent over the broken wheel when hoofbeats cut through the storm. A horse emerged from the rain, dark and large, its rider broad-shouldered beneath a soaked riding coat. He dismounted before the animal had quite stilled, handing the reins to the groom who had materialized behind him. He moved with the unthinking authority of a man obeyed too often to notice it. "You will get no farther with that," he said, his voice low and even. Water streamed from the brim of his hat. His coat and boots were spattered with mud, nearly to the knee. He had no sign of rank upon him, no polished elegance, only a face that might have been carved to endure weather and bad news with equal calm. He was not handsome in the easy, smiling way Bella would have admired. His mouth was too grave for that, and his features too strong. But there was something arresting in the severity of him, as if all his softness had gone inward long ago and never quite returned. The driver bobbed and explained. The gentleman listened once, then turned his gaze on Eleanor. "You should go back inside the carriage." "I should prefer to know whether I am to spend the night in a ditch," she said. For the briefest instant, something almost like surprise touched his expression. "The house is less than a mile." "Then I shall walk." In that gown, she looked down and saw the rain darkening the hem of her traveling dress, turning the edge of her petticoat brown. Irritation flared, sharp enough to warm her. "I was not aware my clothes required your approval." "No," he said, "only dry floors." The driver made a strangled sound, as if terrified she had just offended someone important to the estate. Eleanor, already cold and mortified, and more frightened than she wished to show, lifted her chin. "I beg your pardon if my presence threatens the floors. I am expected." "By whom?" A dozen answers rushed to her lips. She could not bear any of them. Not by the Duke. Not truly. Not by a friend. Not even by name. She heard herself say, with a bitterness the rain seemed to pull from her, by an old promise, a little family sentiment, and the practical value of marrying off an inconvenient woman before she becomes entirely expensive. The man's gaze sharpened. You speak very plainly of your own arrival. No one else has yet felt obliged to speak plainly to me at all. She pushed a strand of wet hair back beneath her hood. I am going to Ashbourne Hall to be looked over by a duke I have never met, because dead people with titles once thought the matter sensible. If I cannot be plain in the rain to a stranger in muddy boots, I do not know when plainness might ever be permitted me. His mouth changed. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and far more dangerous. And if the Duke proves sensible as well, then I shall pity him. That did make the driver choke. The stranger's brows lifted. Pity him? For being surrounded by people who believe marriages can be arranged like shelves in a linen press. The words came faster now, carried by cold and humiliation and the absurd freedom of believing herself unheard beyond this stretch of wet road. For never knowing whether a bowed head means affection or dependence, for thinking he may choose honestly while everyone around him counts horses and acres. Rain ran from the brim of his hat onto the hard line of his cheek. You imagine a great deal about a man you have not met. I imagine only enough to be afraid of him. Something in that seemed to strike him deeper than her mockery had. He looked at her for a long second, and when he spoke again, his tone had lost its dryness. Then do not fear a title before you have seen the man. She almost laughed at the unfairness of that. Easy advice, sir, from someone who clearly does not have one. He glanced down at his coat, at the mud on his sleeves, then back at her, clearly. If she had not been shivering, she might have noticed more. Instead, she only saw that he removed his gloves, handed them to the groom, and spoke briefly to the driver, before turning again to her. A cart will come for your trunk. My horse can carry you to the house. I would rather walk. You will arrive half frozen. I should prefer that to arriving indebted. His gaze held hers. For one dangerous heartbeat, she thought she had truly angered him. Then he nodded once, almost respectfully. As you wish. The path by the beech trees is firmer than the main road. Thomas will take you. He stepped back and motioned to the groom. Eleanor gathered her wet skirts and started forward, then paused. Sir. Yes? Thank you. He inclined his head. I think, miss? She stared. You know my name. You said you were expected. Miss Vale, she answered after a beat. His eyes, dark even in that silver rain, did not leave her face. Miss Vale, I think Ashbourne may surprise you. I have had enough surprises for one afternoon. Then let us hope the next one is kinder. She should have asked his name. She should have noticed the way the groom waited upon his silence rather than his words, or the way the driver had gone pale as chalk. But the rain was cutting into her shoes, and pride was all that kept her back straight as she followed the servant through the beech trees toward the looming shape of Ashbourne Hall. By the time she reached the house, her cloak was heavy with water and her heart with apprehension. Ashbourne rose from the storm like something too old to care for weather. Its long stone front glimmered wetly between columns and shuttered windows. Light burned in the lower rooms. Smoke curled from chimneys. Somewhere inside waited dry carpets, polished silver, strangers with opinions, and a duke she had just pitied to the face of one of his own men. A tall woman in plum silk received her in the lesser hall with thin courtesy and disapproval so practiced it barely seemed personal. Miss Vale, she said, I am Lady Augusta St. Clair, the Duke's aunt. Eleanor dropped into a curtsy, cold spreading through her bones. We had begun to wonder whether the roads would keep you until morning. Your room is prepared. Dinner is in 40 minutes. Try, if you can, to make something of yourself. Ashbourne is rather full. Rather full. A maid led Eleanor upstairs through corridors lined with portraits so grand they seemed to watch her trespass. In her chamber, a fire snapped in the grate, and her trunk had somehow arrived before her. She stripped off her wet clothes with fingers gone clumsy from cold. One of her day dresses was damp through from the leaking carriage roof. The second had been crushed beneath a broken latch and stained by lamp oil. There was only one decent gown left. She unfolded her mother's silver blue dress and held it up before the fire. Even dry, it looked painfully modest beside the grandeur around her. The silk had lost its shine, except where candlelight caught old weaving. The lace at the square neckline had been turned once, then carefully mended. It was neither fashionable nor impressive. It looked exactly what it was, something loved into survival. For a wild moment, she considered feigning illness, but Aunt Lydia's voice rose from memory with cruel clarity. Do not return rejected and troublesome. If Eleanor fled now, she would go back not to safety, but to dependence sharpened by contempt. So she dressed. When the maid fastened the final hooks, Eleanor stood before the mirror and saw not a beauty, not even a likely bride, but a woman too honest to hide how vulnerable she felt. The gown lay softly against her waist. The blue deepened her eyes. Her mother's small pearl comb held back her dark hair. There was no ornament left beyond that. Very pretty, miss, the maid whispered, perhaps out of kindness. Eleanor almost told her not to say things so gentle unless she meant them. Instead, she only thanked her and walked downstairs into judgment. The drawing room dazzled. Candles blazed in mirrored sconces. Diamonds flashed at white throats. Laughter drifted over polished wood and gilded ceilings. Ladies in rose and ivory and gold turned their heads as she entered, each look a quick measure. She felt at once too old and too young, too plain and too visible. Lady Augusta, enthroned near the hearth, lifted one hand in acknowledgement but did not rise. Miss Vale, she announced to no one in particular, as one might acknowledge the arrival of a parcel. Several gentlemen bowed. A beautiful woman in pale green satin, Lady Viola Merceron, if Eleanor guessed rightly, allowed her gaze to travel over the worn blue silk and then away again with exquisite indifference. Eleanor took the chair nearest a potted palm and wished fervently for invisibility. The butler's voice cut through the hum. His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne. She looked up. The man from the rain crossed the threshold. He was no longer in muddy boots and soaked wool. Black evening clothes made him seem taller, harder. The severe planes of his face had not softened under candlelight. If anything, elegance sharpened them. A signet ring flashed at his hand. The entire room altered around him with the subtle, immediate shift that happens when true power enters and everyone pretends not to notice. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face so quickly she thought she might fall. He saw her at once. For one suspended second, the room vanished. He looked directly at her, and in his eyes she did not find amusement, nor rebuke, nor triumph. She found something far more unnerving, a stillness so intent it felt like touch. His gaze moved, not rudely, but completely, over the silver blue gown, the old lace, the simple pearl comb, the hands she had clenched too tightly in her lap. Not appraisal, recognition, as though the whole brilliant room had dissolved, and there was only this one worn ribbon of blue silk. This one woman who had arrived afraid and refused to lie prettily about it. Then Lady Augusta rose. Society resumed breathing, and the Duke turned to receive a cluster of greetings. Eleanor sat very straight, hearing again her own voice in the rain. I shall pity him. I imagine only enough to be afraid of him. Someone offered her a glass of ratafia. She took it and nearly dropped it because her fingers had gone numb. He had let her speak. He had stood in the rain and let her pour out humiliation at his feet, and he had said nothing. What sort of man did that? What sort of man looked at a woman in a faded gown as if she were the only candle left burning? Dinner was an ordeal, lit by silver and watched by too many eyes. Eleanor found herself seated halfway down the table, opposite a colonel's cheerful widow and 3 places from Lady Viola, who wore emeralds like a challenge. The Duke sat at the far end beneath a portrait of some martial ancestor. Conversation moved around her in polished currents she could not quite enter, yet she was aware of him with painful constancy. Once, when a footman set down a dish and brushed her sleeve, nearly knocking her wine, The Duke looked up before the glass had even steadied. Once, when Lady Augusta asked with smiling malice whether Miss Vale had travelled from a very small household, Eleanor answered calmly that small households taught one the proportion of things, and she felt, though she did not raise her eyes, the weight of his attention. Once, when Lady Viola laughed that old country promises had a habit of breeding dramatic legends, he said quietly from the head of the table, "Some promises survive because they were spoken by better people than we are." Silence followed. Lady Viola coloured. Eleanor's pulse did not settle for the rest of the course. At dessert he rose and came toward the ladies' end of the table. Every instinct in Eleanor urged retreat. She had no path for it. He stopped beside her chair. "Miss Vale, Your Grace." The title felt strange in her mouth, too formal to cover the memory of rain. "I hope your room is comfortable after such a journey. It is very kind of you to ask." He regarded her for a moment. Kindness had little to do with it. "I wish to know." No one else at the table could have heard the words, yet Lady Augusta's eyes narrowed, and Lady Viola's fan stilled. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. "Then I am quite well, thank you." His glance dropped very briefly to the cuff of her gown, where the old men showed beneath candlelight. When he looked back at her, something unreadable had deepened in his face. "I am glad." He moved away before she could make sense of why the simple phrase sounded almost unlike relief and dangerously like restraint. The ladies withdrew. In the drawing room, music began at the pianoforte, and conversation broke into smaller, sharper circles. Eleanor stood near a tall window, trying to compose herself. Outside, rain streamed over the glass in silver lines. Inside, Lady Viola's laughter rang like crystal. Lady Augusta approached with a softness that was more threatening than open rudeness. "You have had an eventful arrival." "Yes, my lady. My nephew dislikes scenes. He values composure. I shall try not to distress him by breathing too visibly." Lady Augusta's smile thinned. Wit is often an expensive luxury in dependent girls. Eleanor lowered her eyes before anger could undo her. "Then I shall spend it sparingly." A pause. Then, perhaps because cruelty grows bolder when it senses resistance, Lady Augusta said, "I trust you understand your position here. The old promise was never a contract. Adrian will act honorably, of course. If marriage does not recommend itself, an income may be settled. No one wishes you anxious. An income may be settled. Marriage does not recommend itself." There it was at last, her value explained in neat alternatives. "I am very grateful for His Grace's consideration," Eleanor said, and hated how true and false that sentence was at once. Lady Augusta drifted away, satisfied perhaps that the point had landed. Eleanor stood quite still. The room had grown too warm. She needed air, space, anything that did not glitter or condescend. Slipping through a side door, she found herself in a small adjoining library lined with dark shelves and one long table scattered with maps. The door had barely closed behind her when a voice said from the shadows, "My aunt has never mistaken bluntness for kindness." She turned. The Duke stood near the hearth, a brandy glass in one hand. He had removed his coat. In shirt sleeves and waistcoat, he looked less ceremonial and more dangerous, as if the man from the rain had stepped partly back into the room. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor said. "I did not know that anyone might seek refuge here." He set the glass aside. "You are not the first. I can leave. I would rather you did not." The words dropped between them with too much honesty. Eleanor clasped her hands to keep them steady. "Then I must apologize, Your Grace, for the road, for what I said, for not understanding to whom I spoke. Would you have spoken differently if you had known?" "Yes. That is precisely why I am glad you did not." She stared at him. No man had ever answered her confusion by deepening it so efficiently. "I was rude. You were frightened. I was also rude." At that, one corner of his mouth moved. It transformed him more than a smile would have done. "I have been called worse in finer weather. You should have told me who you were." "Yes," he said after a beat. "I should have." The quiet admission disarmed her more than any defense could have done. She looked away, toward the table strewn with old papers. "I have made myself ridiculous before dinner on the very first evening. That is a talent even my aunt did not credit me with." "You have made yourself singular," he said, "which is not the same thing." She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck. It was absurd that silence should seem so crowded. "I suppose," she said carefully, "that I am here because singularity is under consideration." His expression changed again, shadows crossing it. "You are here because two people now dead loved your mother and believed Ashbourne ought to be open to you always. And because of the second part of the promise, yes." She gathered the frayed edge of her cuff between finger and thumb. "I do not mean to entrap you, Your Grace." His answer came at once. "I know. So much certainty for a man who met me in a ditch. I knew it in the rain," he said. "I know it better now." Her breath caught. There was nothing flirtatious in his tone. That made it far harder to bear. He crossed to the table and drew out a small packet tied in faded ribbon. "These were found among my mother's papers after she died. I had not read them until your letter came." He handed them to her. The ribbon was old blue, nearly the color of her gown. Eleanor untied it with trembling fingers. Inside were letters in her mother's hand, written to the late Duchess in the easy intimacy of girlhood. Jokes, confidences, small sorrows, descriptions of wild roses by the rectory gate. One line caught her so fiercely she could scarcely see the rest. "If ever my Ellie is alone, promise me she shall not be made to feel that she has been merely sent somewhere out of usefulness." Her throat closed. "I did not know these existed," she whispered. "Nor did I." His voice had gone quieter. "My mother wrote on the back of one that your mother once mended this gown for a ball and declared no compliment mattered half so much as being understood by one person in a room of 50. Eleanor's head lifted. "You know this gown?" "I know what my mother wrote." His gaze moved over the silver-blue silk with grave attention. She remembered it. "I think she would be pleased that you wore it here." The room blurred for a moment. No one had looked at the dress and seen anything but poverty. This man saw memory. She swallowed. "I wore it because I had nothing finer." "I am glad you had nothing finer." The words were so softly spoken that for a second she thought she had imagined them. Then she looked at him and knew she had not. Something shifted inside her then, not trust, not yet, but the dangerous beginning of believing she might be seen without being diminished. It made her want to flee. It made her want to stay until dawn. He seemed to feel the same strain, for he stepped back and inclined his head. "You should return. My aunt will otherwise decide I have hidden you for dramatic effect." The spell broke enough for embarrassment to return. "I would not wish to damage your reputation on the first evening as well as your patience. My reputation has survived worse than honesty, Miss Vale." She moved toward the door, the letters held carefully against her heart. At the threshold she paused. "Your Grace." "Yes?" "In the rain, you said Ashbourne might surprise me." His eyes did not leave hers. "It has not yet begun." Sleep eluded her. She lay awake in the strange bed, while the fire settled into red sighing light, and every conversation of the evening replayed itself with merciless clarity. The Duke had looked at her as though the dress mattered because she wore it. He had given her her mother's letters. He had made Lady Viola fall silent with a single sentence. None of it changed the bare truth. She was at Ashbourne to be judged. But now judgment had a face, and that face was far too difficult to dismiss. At breakfast, she discovered the household was assembled like an army of polished intentions. Lady Augusta presided at the urn. Lady Viola shone in lilac muslin. Gentlemen discussed horses and Parliament. Eleanor had scarcely taken her seat when the Duke entered from the terrace doors, wind in his hair and a spaniel at his heels. He bowed to his aunt, spoke to a visiting baron, and then, without seeming to do anything remarkable, took the chair beside Eleanor. Every eye at the table sharpened. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She nearly dropped the marmalade spoon. "Yes, Your Grace." "Very well. You are pale." "I had not expected to have my complexion reviewed over coffee." His gaze held a flash of that almost smile again. Then I shall review your toast instead. Mrs. Brindle insists the kitchen burns it whenever guests arrive. The housekeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes at the sideboard, gave a scandalized protest. The Duke answered with such grave courtesy that several people laughed, and Eleanor realized with surprise that he had deliberately broken the tension gathering around her. Lady Augusta set down her cup. Adrian, Lady Viola was just asking whether you mean to show us the West Rose Walk. I had not decided. How very unlike you to hesitate over beauty, Lady Viola said, her voice smooth as cream. He buttered a piece of toast and passed it to Eleanor before replying. Beauty rarely requires my decision, Lady Viola, only my attention. Something hot and bewildering moved through Eleanor. She could not tell whether he meant the words at all, or whether she had only become too ready to hear meanings not intended for her. Later that morning, needing escape from the bright skirmishes of the drawing room, she wandered into the old part of the house, where fewer guests ventured. Ashbourne was immense, but age softened grandeur in the quieter corridors. Carpets hushed her steps. Dusty light spilled through tall windows. In one room, she found shelves of estate ledgers, stacked maps, and a large table on which tenant accounts lay sorted in neat bundles. She should have gone out at once. Instead, she paused over a ledger left open, curiosity pricking through discouragement. Her father had been a clergyman with the soul of a scholar and the habits of a steward. Numbers had never frightened her. She saw at once that a column of winter coal disbursements had been entered twice. "So," said the Duke's voice behind her, "you break into my records and improve them in a single breath." She turned, one hand still on the page. The room was open. And the arithmetic offended me. He came to stand beside her. Today he wore a dark coat and plain cravat, no ornament at all. Up close, he smelled faintly of cold air and leather. "Show me," she pointed. He bent, his sleeve brushing hers, and examined the figures. "Mrs. Brindle has been saying Hales's clerk cannot add. I believed her only because she usually believes everyone else incompetent on principle." He likely copied the previous line by habit. Likely. He looked at her, not the ledger. "Did your father teach you accounts?" "He taught me that neglect often hides in respectable handwriting." That startled a laugh from him. Brief, real, unexpectedly young. It altered his whole face. Eleanor had the strange feeling that she had been granted sight of something not often shown. "You speak as though you have met neglect in person. Have not we all?" The warmth faded from his expression into something more thoughtful. "Yes," he said. "I imagine we have," he asked her then, with a seriousness no one had ever thought to give such a skill, whether she would mind helping Mrs. Brindle review several charity ledgers. The village school accounts were in disorder, and his aunt considered such details beneath notice. Eleanor agreed before pride could interfere. It was, after all, a task, not a courtship. A usefulness, not a compliment. She spent the next 2 hours beside Mrs. Brindle in a smaller morning room, sorting bills for candles and copybooks, ribbons and broth. The housekeeper, once reassured Eleanor was not there to judge, proved affectionate and shrewd. She spoke of Ashbourne's tenants, the Duke's stubborn habit of riding out in any weather, and the new roof on the schoolroom he had paid for without fanfare after a winter storm. "He looks colder than he is," Mrs. Brindle said, as she tied up a stack of receipts, "though I dare say he would be vexed to hear it." Something eased in Eleanor at that. Then Mrs. Brindle added, "Still, a man cannot run an estate on tenderness alone, and his Grace has had more sorrow than most by 36. 36? Eleanor had somehow imagined him younger and older at once. The housekeeper nodded. "Lost his mother 8 years ago, his father 3, and Lord Julian the same year. It changes a gentleman." Eleanor thought of the Duke's face in the rain. Suddenly the gravity in him seemed less like pride and more like something carried because there had never been a safe place to put it down. When she returned to her room that afternoon, she found a box waiting on the dressing table. Inside lay a pair of new kid gloves, pearl grey, exquisite and clearly expensive. No card. Her cheeks burned. She closed the lid at once and sent the box back with the maid. If the gloves were from Lady Augusta, they were a correction. If they were from the Duke, they were worse. Charity in a finer wrapping was still charity, and she would rather wear mended fingertips than gratitude on her hands. The maid returned 20 minutes later, uncertain and pink. "His Grace says you are entirely at liberty to refuse them, miss, but that the originals in your trunk are split through at both thumbs, and he is weary of watching people pretend not to see when someone is cold." Eleanor stared. There was no answer she could possibly send back to that which did not sound either childish or moved. In the end, she kept the gloves, furious with herself for the relief she felt when the new leather settled soft and warm against her skin. At dinner that evening, Lady Viola wore sapphires. Eleanor wore the grey gloves. The Duke's gaze dropped once to her hands and then rose to her face. Nothing in his expression shifted, but a kind of quiet understanding passed between them, intimate as a murmur. He had not won. She had not yielded. Yet somehow the gloves remained on her wrists, like an argument neither of them wished to end. Small things began to happen after that, and each small thing made the next more perilous. When the wind turned sharp on the south terrace, a footman appeared with a shawl before Eleanor could admit to shivering. It was not rich, merely warm and lined with soft wool. Mrs. Brindle later told her, with all the innocence in the world, that the Duke had noticed the terrace doors were ill-timed for autumn and had ordered several wraps kept nearby for guests. Yet somehow, Lady Viola never seemed to receive one. When the guests rode to the village school, the Duke asked Eleanor's opinion on the reading primers before he asked anyone else's. When a child there burst into tears over a torn slate, Eleanor knelt to soothe her, and the Duke stood in the doorway watching with an expression so unguarded it stole the breath from her. When Lady Augusta remarked within earshot that Ashbourne had become unexpectedly interested in slates and soup since Miss Vale's arrival, he replied, "It is astonishing how much more visible necessities become once one has the good sense to look directly at them." He should not have done it. Each small defense made him kinder to her and crueler to her peace. One afternoon, in the portrait gallery, she paused before a painting of a young woman in pale blue silk, standing beside a summer rosebush. The likeness of the gown struck her first. The face struck her after. "My mother," the Duke said from behind her. Eleanor turned. She wore it too. "Yes." He came to stand beside her, and wrote somewhere that she admired your mother for refusing to flirt with men who bored her. A laugh escaped Eleanor before she could stop it. "My mother said that?" "She said a woman ought not spend her best manners preserving a fool's self-regard." That sounded so entirely like the woman Eleanor had loved that her eyes stung. She moved closer to the portrait, searching for scraps of memory in painted color. The late Duchess's face was open, warm, very unlike the rigid grandeur of Lady Augusta. "She looks happy." She had learned by then how to make islands of happiness inside large houses. His voice lowered. "I think your mother helped teach her." Eleanor kept her gaze on the painting. "My mother always said friendship was the only thing in society that ought to be entirely free." He was silent a moment. "Did she?" "Yes. She said love turned vain when it counted rank, and duty turned cruel when it forgot tenderness." The quiet after that was so deep she heard the clock 2 rooms away strike the quarter hour. When she looked at him, something in his face had gone almost stark. "Your mother was wiser than most statesmen," he said. "She was only a vicar's wife." "No," he said, and his eyes held hers with unnerving force. "She was Marianne Vale." It was such a simple answer, and yet it landed in her like absolution. Not only a station, not only a relation, a self entire enough to be named. That night, Eleanor opened her mother's letters again and cried more softly than she had since childhood. By the end of the first week, the house had noticed. No one said it directly, of course. Society never walked when it could arrange to glide. But conversations altered when she entered. Lady Viola became sunnier in the Duke's presence and icier in his absence. Lady Augusta's questions took on a dangerous polish. One gentleman asked Eleanor whether she hunted, then looked startled when she answered with wit instead of gratitude. Another lady observed that old family friendships could become very convenient at the right time. Eleanor began to feel like a candle placed too near drapery. One spark, and everything would be said aloud. That spark came at luncheon. Lady Viola had spent the morning receiving compliments in a gown of soft yellow gauze, so airy it looked woven from praise itself. The guests admired her taste, her singing, her seat on horseback. Eleanor, who had been helping Mrs. Brindle with inventories, arrived a little late in a plain brown day dress and found the conversation already sharpened to elegance. Lady Viola looked across the table and smiled. "Miss Vale, Lady Evesham was just lamenting how quickly fashions change. I said there is something touching in garments that survive their proper era." Several people glanced, instantly alert. Eleanor laid down her fork. "There is," she said calmly, "especially when they survive by workmanship rather than novelty." Lady Evesham choked on her wine. The Duke, at the far end of the table, lowered his gaze to hide a response that was not sufficiently mournful. Lady Viola's smile held. "You are fortunate, then, to value workmanship. Some women depend too much upon appearance." The room waited. Eleanor met her eyes. "Some women are taught from childhood to depend upon it because they are given nothing else." Silence. Bright, ringing silence. Lady Augusta set down her knife. "Miss Vale." But the Duke spoke first. "My dear Viola, if you mean to discuss appearances, you might at least choose a field where defeat is less certain." No one moved. Lady Viola's colour rose. "I was merely admiring Miss Vale's philosophy." As was I. His tone was perfectly civil. That was what made the cut precise. Everyone heard it. The public choice, slight as a turn of the wrist and twice as devastating. Lady Viola resumed eating, with a hand too steady not to be controlled. Eleanor's pulse would not slow. When luncheon ended, she escaped to the orangery, where late roses climbed ironwork under glass, and damp earth breathed up from terracotta pots. It was warm, green, and nearly empty. She stood beside a lemon tree until she heard the door open behind her. "You should not have defended me," she said without turning. "Why not?" "Because now everyone will think precisely what they were only beginning to suspect. That I dislike rudeness," she faced him then, "that I have encouraged your notice." He came farther into the filtered gold of the orangery. Outside, rain threatened again, silvering the windows. "Have you?" The question was so quiet it unsettled her more than any accusation could have done. "I do not know what I have done," she admitted. "That is the worst part of it." He stopped an arm's length away. Near him, the air seemed thinner. "You have spoken honestly," he said. "You have been kind where kindness was needed, not where it would be admired. You have seen my house more clearly in a week than some people see it in years." His gaze moved over her face, as if he could not help it. "And you wore a gown everyone else called old, as though memory were not shameful." Her breath caught. "Your Grace." "Adrian," he said. She stared. "When we are alone, if you please." No one had ever made intimacy sound so formal. She should have refused. She did not. "Adrian," she said, and the name altered the very shape of the room. His eyes closed for the smallest instant, as if the sound had touched somewhere unprotected. "Eleanor," he answered, and her own name in his mouth became something she had never known it could be. A beat passed, then another. The rain began against the glass in a low, gathering patter. "You should not be kind to me," she whispered. A painful shadow crossed his face. "I am trying very hard not to be merely kind." The words struck low and deep. She stepped back at once, almost upsetting a pot of rosemary. "That is exactly why you should not." He did not follow. That restraint made it harder to breathe. "Because of the promise?" he asked. "Because of what I am here for." Her voice shook, and she hated it. "If you look at me too gently, I cannot tell where pity ends. If you speak to me too honestly, I cannot tell whether I am hearing a man or a duke trying to be honorable. And if I begin to hope—" She broke off. "What then?" He asked it as though he needed the wound, not the answer. Eleanor folded her hands so tightly her knuckles hurt. Then I become ridiculous." He was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was roughened by something she could not name. "No," he said. "Then you become dangerous." To whom? She did not ask. To him, she did not dare believe. The house party went on. There were drives and card tables and music in the evenings. Yet beneath every ordinary pleasure ran a more perilous current. Adrian no longer sought her out constantly, as if he had understood that too much nearness would corner them both. But when they were together, the world seemed to sharpen. He listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her thoughts did not have to earn their right to exist. He asked about the rectory where she had grown up, about her father's sermons and her mother's roses, about the books she loved and the one thing she had wished for at 17 and never said aloud. She told him against all caution that she had once wanted a room with a window seat and shelves to the ceiling, and enough peace to hear herself think. He answered that Ashburn had 7 such windows and not nearly enough peace. In return, he gave pieces of himself rarely and without adornment. He told her his father had believed duty could be performed without affection and had expected gratitude for the omission. He told her that after his younger brother drowned, the house had filled with condolences and felt emptier than before. He did not speak of his broken engagement until the 3rd walk they took together, when the sky was low and gold over the west meadow. "She left because I had become difficult," he said. "Were you?" "Yes." There was no self-pity in the answer. "Grief is inconvenient company." "And she lacked patience?" "She lacked interest in any part of me that was not easy." He looked ahead, not at Eleanor. "I do not blame her for preferring brightness. I blame myself for not seeing sooner that brightness is not the same as warmth." The wind caught at her bonnet ribbons. She wanted, with a force that startled her, to take his gloved hand. Instead, she said, "Some rooms are brightest because they are cold." His gaze turned to her then, and there was such naked recognition in it that she had to look away. At the end of the 2nd week, Ashbourne held a small autumn assembly for neighbouring families. Lady Augusta declared it too intimate to be called a ball and too formal to be neglected. Guests arrived in carriages as twilight deepened. Musicians tuned in the gallery. Footmen lit dozens more candles until the great ballroom glowed like amber. Eleanor stood in her chamber with her mother's gown spread across the bed. She had not meant to wear it again, but her other evening dress, a dark mauve silk Aunt Lydia had once deemed serviceable, had split at the side seam that afternoon, beyond quick repair. Mrs. Brindle sent up a seamstress, but there was no time to alter another. So the silver-blue gown came out once more, and with it, all the old ache. The seamstress, after one look, declared the dress better made than half the new fashions she had touched that season. She reset the hooks, pressed the skirt, and with tiny reverent stitches, strengthened the worn cuff Eleanor had feared might betray itself in dancing. When she was done, the gown seemed not younger, exactly, but steadier, like a memory choosing not to apologize for surviving. Eleanor descended late, heart hammering. The ballroom glittered even more fiercely than the drawing-room had. Jewels moved like sparks. Lady Viola, in crimson satin, stood at the center of a bright circle of admirers. Adrian was speaking to a visiting earl. He turned at some subtle change in the air. He saw Eleanor. Everything in him stilled. She felt it across the room with physical certainty. Not the room's attention, his. He came toward her through silk and candlelight, without seeming aware of anyone else. People turned to watch because people always turned to watch a duke crossing a ballroom, but she scarcely noticed. He stopped before her and bowed. "You wore it again." She should have answered lightly. Instead, the truth escaped. "It was all I had worthy of your ballroom." His gaze was so intent it warmed her skin. "Eleanor, there is not a woman here more beautifully dressed." The world narrowed to the span between them. "You cannot mean that. I have never been more certain of anything easy." Before she could recover, he held out his hand. "Dance with me." It was the first set. Lady Augusta's fan snapped open too quickly. Lady Viola did not move at all. Eleanor knew exactly what acceptance would cost in gossip. She knew refusal would cost more. She placed her hand in his. The music began. He danced with restraint and precision, but his palm at her waist burned through silk and stays like a secret. Around them, couples turned and looked like fragments of some older, more graceful world, but to Eleanor, it seemed there was nothing graceful in the way her heart had begun to beat. He did not once let his hold tighten beyond propriety. That should have comforted her. Instead, it made every measured step feel more intimate, because he was so visibly restraining all the things she had begun to fear in herself. When he bowed over her hand at the end of the figure, his eyes lifted to hers for one devastating moment. "You are trembling," he said. "So are you." A softness, almost incredulous, passed across his face. "Then we are ill-matched for public composure." Before she could answer, Lady Augusta appeared beside them, with a smile polished thin as glass. "Adrian, Lady Viola has been promised the next set." "If she has," he said evenly, "I was not consulted." Lady Augusta's fan moved once. "Really, my dear nephew, one must remember expectations." His gaze never left Eleanor. Must one? The words were not loud. They did not need to be. A murmur stirred along the edges of the room, like wind catching silk. Eleanor felt every eye on her and wanted at once to disappear and to remain where she was forever. She drew in a breath. "Your Grace, I believe Lady Augusta is correct. You should not spend the entire evening frightening your guests." Something almost like protest flickered in him, but he bowed. "You rescue me from my own reputation. Someone must." He stepped back then, but only after the faintest pause, as though leaving her side cost him something actual and unwelcome. For the next hour, she danced twice with gentlemen who spoke too loudly and listened too little. She endured Lady Eversham's bright questions, escaped one clumsy compliment, and laughed dutifully where required. Yet everything in the room had altered, because Adrian had crossed it for her first, and everyone knew it. When Lady Viola took her place at the pianoforte later, singing with polished melancholy, the room gathered itself to admire. Her voice was lovely. No one could deny it. Even Eleanor, who had begun to dread the lift of Lady Viola's chin, could not deny it. Adrian stood near the mantel speaking to the Earl, but once, as the song reached its most delicate passage, his gaze moved not to the singer, but to Eleanor, who stood half-hidden beside the terrace doors. His look said nothing society could condemn. It said everything she could not safely endure. She slipped away before the song was finished. The terrace beyond the ballroom lay cold beneath a cloud-thinned moon. Rain had passed, leaving the stone damp and smelling faintly of leaves. She stood in the dark with one hand against the balustrade and let the night air sting her cheeks. She heard the door open behind her and knew without turning who it was. "You flee at the wrong moments," Adrian said. "I flee at the only moments still available to me." He came to stand beside her. "If this is because I asked you to dance first, I do not repent. That is the trouble. You never seem to repent anything at the correct time." A short breath left him that might have been laughter if it had not sounded so tired. "No, I generally discover the correct time half an hour too late." The moonlight was thin, but enough to silver the line of his jaw. Inside, music drifted faintly through the closed doors. "You should go back," she said. "Lady Augusta will think I lured you out here with scandalous intentions. My aunt thinks scandal arrives whenever feeling does. Does it not?" He turned then, leaning one hand on the stone behind her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that her breath shortened anyway. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "tell me what frightens you more, that people see I prefer your company, or that you have begun to prefer mine." She could not have answered if her life depended on it. The truth was too large and too near. At last she whispered, "It is not preference that frightens me." "What then?" "That I do not know whether you are free." His expression changed. "Free? To choose? To mean what you appear to mean? To be a man, and not merely a duke obeying old gratitude, old promises, old ghosts?" She clasped the damp stone harder. "I could bear being refused. I have borne worse. What I do not know how to bear is being accepted for the sake of honor and treated tenderly in payment." The silence after that hurt. When he spoke, his voice had roughened. "Who taught you to believe tenderness and honor must be enemies?" She almost said everyone. Instead, she looked away. He followed her gaze into the dark gardens. "My father believed marriage was architecture," he said at last. "You matched stone to stone, land to land, family to family, and if affection failed to arise, then at least the roof did not leak. I watched that roof all my life. It leaked in every weather." His hand tightened on the balustrade. "If I offer you anything, Eleanor, it will not be because two dead families thought it neat. I would rather burn the contract than ask you for gratitude." The words struck through her like light through glass. She turned toward him fully then. "Do not say such things when you know I have nowhere safe to put them. Then give them back." His face was close enough now that she could see the strain in it, the fierce discipline holding him motionless. She had never in her life been so conscious of not moving. "I cannot," she said. The answer lived between them like a confession. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Then voices sounded inside. The terrace doors stirred, and Adrian stepped back exactly one pace. It was nothing. It felt like loss. Lady Augusta's maid came searching for Eleanor with unnecessary urgency. There were more guests arriving from the neighboring estate, and Lady Augusta desired every lady present in the receiving line. By the time Eleanor returned to the ballroom, her pulse had steadied, but her peace had not. She took her place. She smiled. She curtsied. She managed not to look at Adrian more often than any reasonable person might. Then Aunt Lydia arrived. The shock of seeing her there was so complete, Eleanor nearly forgot to move. Aunt Lydia swept into the room in plum velvet, trimmed too heavily for fashion, with Arabella beside her in ivory satin and pearl drops at her ears. Bella's fair beauty shone all the brighter for travel. She looked like a fresh rose set among late autumn branches. Lady Augusta went forward at once. So did Lady Viola, whose expression brightened as if reinforcements had at last entered the field. Aunt Lydia embraced Eleanor with a pressure more performative than warm. "My dear child, what an adventure, finding you already established in such splendor." Eleanor stepped back. "I did not know you had been invited." Bella smiled sweetly. "We met Lady Augusta at Lady Fenwick's last week." She was kindness itself. Lady Augusta's mouth suggested she did not regard the invitation in quite the same glowing light, but she could hardly deny it now. Aunt Lydia let her gaze travel over Eleanor's silver blue gown. "Good heavens, you kept that old thing alive after all." The words were spoken lightly. Their effect was not light. Several people heard. Arabella colored faintly, too well bred to enjoy the moment openly, and too honest not to. Adrian, across the room, had gone still. Eleanor might have survived the insult if Aunt Lydia had stopped there, but she continued, her voice pitched for sympathy. "It was her poor mother's dress, you know. We feared she would have nothing respectable enough for Ashbourne, but Eleanor has always been clever with a needle. The humiliation was so swift and naked it burned. Around them, smiles froze in place. Lady Viola's lashes lowered in satisfaction. Bella made a tiny gesture, as if to hush her mother, which only made everything worse by implying an injury too obvious to deny. Eleanor's fingers went cold. She had spent 2 weeks forgetting, in dangerous flashes, what she looked like in the eyes of those who counted value by gleam. Now the room remembered for her. Then Adrian crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He had no need. Silence parted around him more effectively than any command. He stopped beside Eleanor, not facing her but facing Aunt Lydia with perfect, lethal courtesy. "Mrs. Harbury," he said, "I had not been aware this gown possessed such distinction." Aunt Lydia blinked. "Your Grace?" That a room should fall silent merely because it entered. He turned then, and his gaze rested on Eleanor with unmistakable steadiness. "My mother wore similar silk when she was young. I remember thinking, as a boy, that no lady in London could look finer." He let that settle. Then, without lifting his voice, he added, "Tonight, I find my judgment unchanged." No one breathed. He offered Eleanor his arm before the entire room. "Miss Vale, the next dance is mine, if you will still have it." She could not feel her feet. She could scarcely see. But she placed her hand on his sleeve. They moved onto the floor while the musicians, startled and then inspired by the drama of it, began the set a fraction too loudly. Eleanor's vision blurred. She fixed it on Adrian's shoulder until the first figure required her to meet his eyes. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "Because your aunt confused age with shame. You have made it worse." "Yes," he said, "for everyone except you." She almost laughed and almost wept. The dance carried them apart and back together, steps forcing poise where emotion threatened mutiny. At the end of the set, before anyone could intercept them, he guided her through the side doors and down a quieter corridor into the long library. Firelight pooled over rugs and leather bindings. She drew her hand free the instant they were alone. "You cannot keep rescuing me," she said. "People will think I require it. They already think a great many things. That does not make them true." "No." His gaze searched her face. "But it does not make them false either." The last words seemed to strike both of them silent. Eleanor pressed a hand to her burning cheek. "You should not have said that before everyone." "I should have said more, Adrian." Her voice broke on his name, and he stopped as if the sound physically checked him. She turned away because she could not bear the intensity in his face. "You make me forget the room until the room remembers me. Do you understand how cruel that is, even when you do not mean it?" His answer came low. "I understand that I have begun to hate every person who ever taught you to prepare for humiliation before happiness." She closed her eyes. He came nearer, but again did not touch her. "Look at me." Slowly, she did. "I did not find you beautiful because the room fell silent," he said. The room fell silent because it had not the wit to understand what I had seen from the beginning. Her heart beat so hard it hurt. "In the rain," he went on, "you stood in a broken road, drenched and furious, speaking of honesty as if it were the last clean thing left in the world. I have known women more ornamented. I have never known one more beautiful." The room seemed to tilt. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not because she was useful, not because she was good, not because she had behaved properly. Simply because he had looked and found her worthy of wonder. She should have answered. She could not. His hand lifted, stopped just short of her face, then fell again. "If I go on speaking, I shall say something neither of us can safely take back." "Perhaps," she whispered, "that moment has already passed." A flicker of astonishment, and something deeper, moved through him. For one suspended instant, she thought he would gather her to him. Instead, he stepped away, not from want of feeling, but from too much of it. "Then I had better regain my senses before I disgrace us both." She ought to have thanked him for his restraint. She hated him for it instead. The next morning, everything changed. Lady Augusta sent for Eleanor before breakfast. She received her in the small blue morning room, with Aunt Lydia seated nearby and Arabella at the window looking distressed enough to be decorative. A letter lay open on the table. "Miss Vale," Lady Augusta said, "there is a matter of family delicacy that must be addressed before this house drifts into melodrama." Eleanor remained standing. "What matter?" Aunt Lydia lifted the letter. "Your father wrote to me shortly before his death. I had forgotten, in all the confusion of that terrible time, the exact nature of his wishes." Forgotten. The word tasted of old excuses. Lady Augusta extended a hand. "The letter, if you please, Mrs. Harbury." Eleanor took it. It was indeed her father's hand, weaker than she remembered. The ink blurred in places. She read once. Then again, because the meaning would not at first remain still. He wrote of failing health, of gratitude for Lydia's temporary care, of dread that Eleanor might become a burden to those without means to protect her. Then, in a passage underlined faintly as if by a trembling pen, he said this: "If Ashbourne's old offer still stands, I would have my daughter go freely, but never as a claimant. Let her not be pressed into marriage by any prior understanding of which she has no full knowledge. I would rather see her poor and proud than accepted from pity or debt. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the page. I never saw this, she said. Aunt Lydia pressed a hand to her breast. In the confusion after his death, so many papers, so many were useful to misplace. The words left Eleanor before caution could stop them. Arabella turned sharply. Lady Augusta's brows rose, but not in disapproval. Eleanor, Aunt Lydia said, flushing, do not be theatrical. The point is plain. Your father expressly forbade pressure. If Adrian has shown you civil attention, it cannot alter that his family's promise was never binding. Lady Augusta folded her hands. You see the delicacy. Adrian is an honorable man, but honor can be manipulated by appearance. It would be unkind to let him feel cornered by sentiment sharpened into spectacle. The insult was wrapped too neatly to refute at once. Eleanor heard the true accusation beneath it. You have overstepped, and now we possess proof. She read the letter again. Her father's words did not wound. They protected. That was what broke her. He had known even then what she might face. He had tried, with failing strength, to defend her from exactly this. May I keep this? She asked. Lady Augusta studied her a moment. It concerns you. Yes. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her reticule. I thank you for showing it to me. Aunt Lydia exhaled, already thinking herself successful. Then you understand. Yes, Eleanor said. I understand at last. She went out, before either woman could stop her. She did not cry. The wound was too clean for tears. Instead, she walked the length of the east corridor, descended the back stairs, crossed the still cold hall, and went out into the morning, with no bonnet and no destination except distance. The lawns were silver with mist. Somewhere, a rook called. Her father's letter lay against her side like a hand laid once too late upon a child's bowed head. She had been right all along. Hope was not merely dangerous, it was disloyal to the dead. By the time Adrian found her in the walled garden, she had almost convinced herself she could speak calmly. He came through the gate bareheaded, as if he had left breakfast mid-sentence. Mrs. Brindle said you were here. I did not know I required reporting. You disappeared. His gaze sharpened at once. What has happened? She drew the letter from her reticule and held it out. My father happened. He read it standing in the thin morning sun. The silence grew longer and heavier. When at last he lowered the page, there was no anger in his face, only a grave stillness she had begun to dread because it meant he felt too much to show quickly. Where did you get this? From Lady Augusta, via Aunt Lydia, who apparently remembered at a convenient hour that my father did not wish me married by obligation. His jaw hardened. Convenient indeed. He was right. She heard how flat her own voice sounded. He knew what he was doing, even if none of us did. Adrian folded the letter with great care. Do you think I mean to oblige him by resenting his wisdom? No. Then what do you think, Eleanor? She made herself answer honestly, because he had taught her, perhaps fatally, that honesty was safer with him than pretense. I think this ends what should not have begun. The words landed like a blow. She saw it. He did not disguise it quickly enough. Because your father wished you free, he asked. Because I must be free of debt, if I am to know myself at all. Because if I stay now, every look will say I remained to secure what he asked others not to press. She lifted her chin, though it trembled. And because, if you were to ask me anything while I stood under your roof after reading that letter, I should never be certain whether your desire and your conscience had become tangled beyond mercy. He took one step toward her. And if I told you my conscience lost the battle a week ago? She shut her eyes. Do not. I cannot seem to do anything wise where you are concerned, so I may as well commit the whole offense. I do not want freedom from you. I do not want gratitude. I want... He stopped himself with visible force, fingers closing once around the folded paper. Eleanor's heart was breaking so sharply she almost welcomed the pain because it was at least not uncertainty. That is exactly why I must go. He stared at her. Today? Yes. The garden seemed to hold its breath. At last he said, very quietly, "If I ask you to stay one more day, will you hear it as a request from a man?" "No," she whispered. "I will hear it as a thing I cannot survive and still trust myself." He looked away then, toward the bare peach branches against the brick wall. She had not known a man could seem proud and stricken in the same instant. When he faced her again, all that remained visible was discipline. "Then I will not ask." Some wild, wounded part of her had wanted him to. That was the cruelest thing of all. He held out the letter. She did not take it. "Keep it," she said, "if only so you remember that someone once loved me enough to fear for me." His eyes closed briefly, as if I required instruction. She left Ashbourne before noon. No one stopped her openly. Lady Augusta sent regrets and a basket of provisions. Aunt Lydia declared herself astonished by such haste, but not enough to offer useful comfort. Arabella embraced Eleanor at the carriage door with tears in her eyes, and whispered, "I think he loves you," in a voice too broken to be theatrical. Eleanor could not answer. She climbed into the carriage with her mother's gown packed away, her father's letter gone, and Adrian nowhere in sight. Only when the horses started forward did she see him. He stood at the top of the front steps, coatless in the pale cold, one hand on the stone balustrade. He did not wave, he did not call after her, he only watched, as though if he moved he would dishonor the choice he had let her make. The carriage turned, the house vanished. She learned then how quiet heartbreak can be when it has been dressed all morning in good manners. Aunt Lydia received her return with a satisfaction she tried hard to disguise as concern. Within 3 days, Eleanor understood why. Mr. Swithin, a widowed manufacturer from Leeds with a prosperous mill and 2 noisy sons, had lately expressed a practical interest in a wife of steady temper. Aunt Lydia, whose imagination could rarely rise above arithmetic, considered the matter providential. "He asks no impossible romance," she said, while arranging violets in a china bowl. "You would have a house, position, and children to govern. At 27, Eleanor, one should not wait for moonlight." Eleanor stood at the window, looking out on the lane where bare hedges shivered in a grey wind. "I am only 25. Aunt Lydia waved this aside. "In matters of marriage, years are counted by prospects, not birthdays." The cruelty was almost too stale to sting. Almost. Mr. Swithin called twice. He was not unkind. That made everything worse. Had he been vulgar or openly greedy, refusal would have come easier. Instead, he was earnest, practical, and faintly bewildered by women. He praised Eleanor's composure, her skill at calming his sons over jam tarts, and her apparent indifference to frivolity. He wanted a wife the way a well-run house wants sound hinges, for steadiness, not delight. On the second visit, while the boys chased each other through the corridor with wooden swords, he asked whether she liked the country. "I like truth," she said before she could soften it. He blinked. "A valuable quality in a wife." "No," Eleanor said. "A dangerous one." He did not return for several days after that. Arabella, to her credit, took Eleanor's side in small, unsuccessful ways. She brought tea unasked, left fashion plates unopened, and once said abruptly, "Mamma thinks if one cannot marry a duke, one ought at least to marry money. It is not a philosophy I admire." Eleanor looked up from the mending in her lap. "I did not know you had begun despising your own inheritance." Bella's mouth trembled. "Do not be unfair. I know I have been vain, but I am not blind." "No," Eleanor said gently, "only fortunate." Bella sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her clasped hands. "He looked at you as if the whole room were a nuisance arranged between his eyes and your face." Eleanor's needle slipped. Bella went on in a rush, as though confession once begun could not be neatly tied off. "I used to think beauty was the safest power a woman could have. Then I watched Lady Viola wear all hers like a queen and fail to move him by an inch, while you stood in Mamma's awful old stories and that blue gown and made him forget every other creature in the room." She lifted wet eyes. "I am ashamed of how often I enjoyed comparisons made in my favor." Eleanor set down the mending. "Bella, no, let me say it once properly. You were always the one sent to fetch, to soothe, to mend, to read aloud when someone was dull, to remain when prettier company was wanted elsewhere. I let it happen because it suited me. And then he came, and for the first time in my life, I saw a room rearrange itself around truth instead of prettiness. Her voice broke. I think that is why Mama hated it so much. Eleanor had no ready answer. She had prayed for vindication once or twice in bitterer years, but she had never imagined it might come through her sister's remorse. She took Bella's hand. We were both raised in the same house, she said. It taught us wrong things differently. Bella clung to her fingers a moment, then whispered, Do you love him? Eleanor looked down at the worn blue thread still looped through her needle. Yes. The word seemed to clear the air. No denial remained possible after it. Arabella covered her face. Then what will you do? Eleanor thought of Ashbourne's stone terraces, of Adrian in the rain, of his face when she said she must go. Endure, she answered, at least until endurance becomes impossible. It became impossible sooner than she had expected. A week after her return, a packet arrived from Ashbourne addressed in Adrian's hand. She carried it to her room before opening it. Inside lay her father's letter and another page, folded only once. Eleanor, you left me the argument and took away the right to answer it. This is unfair, but perhaps fairer than anything I have earned. I return your father's letter because it belongs with you. I have read it until I could recite every line and still not know whether to thank him or curse him. He wished you free. So do I. What I cannot seem to wish is that your freedom should lead you further from me. You accused me once of being surrounded by people who arrange lives like shelves in a linen press. You were right. I had thought myself exempt because I despised the habit. It appears one may despise a prison and still discover one has the keys in one's pocket. I will not use my house, my name, or the dead to press you. But neither will I let silence do the work of cowardice. If ever you can believe that I ask for you not from duty and not from gratitude, but from a selfish and entirely ungovernable desire to spend the rest of my life hearing what you think before anyone else speaks, send me one line. I will come. If not, I shall trouble you no further, except to remain, with more truth than is convenient. Adrian Eleanor sat down on the bed, because her knees would not hold her. There was no proposal in the formal sense, no flourish, no plea, only the plainest and most impossible thing, a man of power laying it aside and asking to be believed without it. She read the letter until the words blurred. Then she folded it again and locked it in her workbox because if she kept it on her person, she feared she might live too openly. For 3 days, she answered nothing. On the 4th, Aunt Lydia announced at supper that Mr. Swithin would call the following Tuesday with a view to understanding Eleanor's final sentiments. Arabella dropped her spoon. Eleanor looked at her plate and thought, with eerie calm, that one can hear the hinges of one's future closing if the room is quiet enough. That night, she took Adrian's letter from the workbox and laid it beside the candle. She ought to have written, either yes or no. Mercy demanded one of them, but the pen remained still in her hand because some part of her had not yet resolved the central terror. If she called him and he came, would she know she had not simply summoned the one man generous enough to save her from a lesser fate? Morning brought a worse cruelty. Certainty could not be achieved in safety. It never had been. Before she could choose, news chose for her. A rider came from the village at noon. Mr. Hales's eldest daughter, Anne, one of Eleanor's former pupils from the little school near the rectory, had been taken ill with a fever that was now spreading through 3 cottages by the Marsh Road. The local doctor was away attending a confinement. Mrs. Hales had asked if Miss Vale might come, if only to sit with the children and read instructions from the old medical guide in the rectory chest. Aunt Lydia protested at once. Disease, impropriety, mud, Mr. Swithin's approaching call. Eleanor was already tying her bonnet. She spent the next 2 days in the Marsh cottages amid vinegar steam, damp sheets, frightened children, and the sour metallic scent of fever. She brewed willow bark, cooled foreheads, coaxed broth into unwilling mouths, and slept in a chair for an hour at a time. Her hands remembered useful things, even while her heart remained in Ashbourne's library and on its cold front steps. On the second evening, while she sat beside Anne's bed with a lamp turned low, hoofbeats sounded outside. The door opened. Adrian entered. For a moment she thought fever had passed from the child into her own blood. He looked larger somehow in the cramped cottage, too finely cut for the low beams and rush matting, yet entirely at home where need existed. Mud marked his boots. His dark coat was damp at the hem. Behind him stood the doctor, flushed and apologetic. "I met His Grace on the road from Fen Market," the man said. "He insisted on bringing me at once." Eleanor rose so abruptly her chair tipped. "What are you doing here?" Adrian's gaze went first to Anne, then to the basin, the cloths, the medicine, and lastly to Eleanor's exhausted face. Something moved in him at the sight of her and was immediately contained. "Coming," he said simply, "as threatened. I did not send for you. No." His voice gentled in a way that made her chest hurt. "But I heard you had gone where everyone else was afraid to follow." The doctor went to the child. Mrs. Hales burst into tears of gratitude from the corner, the cottage filled with practical movement. In the midst of it, Adrian stood before Eleanor, as if they were once again alone in some impossible hush. "You should not be here," she whispered. "Because you did not choose the manner of my arrival?" "Because this is not your concern." His eyes held hers. "Everything that weakens you is my concern now, whether you permit it or not." She ought to have rebuked him. Instead, she sat down hard because the room had swayed beneath her. He caught the back of the chair before she slid from it. "You are worn through," he said. "I am only tired." That is the sort of lie women tell before they collapse. The doctor looked over and frowned. "Miss Vale has a fever coming herself if she does not rest. I have no time." "You have no choice," Adrian said. He was not stern with her often. The effect was immediate and absurdly intimate, as though he had suddenly claimed a right over her health she had never granted and could not quite resent. Mrs. Hales, wringing her apron, said, "Miss, if His Grace stays till the doctor sees to Annie, perhaps you might lie down next door for a spell." "No," Eleanor began. Adrian crouched before her chair so that only she could hear him. The movement, the sheer humility of it from such a man, undid something in her almost more than any declaration. "If you faint from pride, I shall be forced to carry you out before 3 cottagers and a doctor," he murmured. "Consider your reputation." Despite exhaustion, a laugh escaped her. It ended in a shake of breath. "That is blackmail." "Yes," he said. "I am using the blunt tools left to me." She let them guide her into the adjacent room, where a narrow bed stood beneath a patched quilt. She meant only to sit. The next thing she knew, she was waking to darkness. A fire burned low, and Adrian seated in the straight-back chair by the hearth with his coat off and one of the Hales boys asleep against his shoulder. For a few seconds, she only watched. He had one hand resting lightly on the child's back to keep him from slipping. His head was bent over an open medical guide. The lamplight caught the severe line of his face, gentling it. He looked not like a duke or a landowner or a man bred to be watched, but simply like someone who had learned not to move when another person needed sleep. The sight lodged in her chest with terrible sweetness. He sensed her waking and looked up at once. Relief, fierce and unguarded, crossed his features before he could conceal it. "How long?" she whispered. 3 hours. "You stayed." He glanced down at the boy against him, as if the answer were obvious. There was nowhere better to be. The child stirred. Adrian's hand smoothed his hair with absent tenderness. Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly, not because the gesture was grand, but because it was unobserved. No ballroom, no audience, no possibility of admiration, only care. She pushed herself upright. "How is Anne?" "Sleeping. The doctor believes the fever may break by morning." She let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank God." "Yes." He rose carefully, lifting the child and settling him on a pallet in the corner, with more gentleness than many mothers managed in health. Then he turned back to her. "You should eat. I am not hungry." That has never stopped me from insisting before. She took the bread and broth he handed her because she lacked the strength to argue. He watched until she swallowed the first spoonful. Something in his posture eased then, though not enough. At last she said, "You must know this changes nothing." "Must I?" "Yes, very well." He folded his arms. "Then let us speak of nothing while you regain the power to wound me properly." She looked down into the broth, because if she met his eyes, she would either surrender or ask too much. "I never meant to wound you." "No, nor I you." Yet we continue with admirable symmetry. Silence stretched, but not an empty one. Outside, the wind moved along the cottage walls. "I received your letter," she said at last. "I know." The absence of reply was eloquent. "I did not know what truth would be." He leaned one shoulder against the hearth. "And do you know now?" She thought of him riding into the fever village without summons, of him sitting with a sleeping boy on his shoulder, of the stillness in him whenever she was tired or angry or afraid. Truth did not feel clearer. It felt less deniable. "I know," she said slowly, "that when there is trouble, you move toward it." His expression altered. "Only if you are standing in the middle of it." The words seemed to warm the little room more than the fire. She set down the bowl with careful hands. "Adrian, if I call you to me, I must be able to believe I am not merely choosing safety." He came nearer then, stopping just beyond touch. "And if I tell you that I am asking for the most unsafe thing a man like me can ask?" She looked up. "You think title protects," he said. "Often it only hardens expectation. I have been admired, deferred to, obeyed, and planned around since I was born. Do you know how many people have refused me because they feared hurting my conscience more than losing me?" Her throat tightened. He went on, quieter now. "You are the first person before whom I have ever felt uncertain in a way that made me grateful. The first whose opinion of me I wanted before I deserved it. The first who looked at Ashbourne and saw both its beauty and its tyranny in the same glance." His eyes did not leave hers. "Do not insult what I feel by calling it rescue. Rescue is what I could offer anyone. This," he broke off, as if language had finally failed him. "This what?" she whispered. "This is hunger," he said. "This is peace. This is every room altered once you have left it." Her breath trembled out of her. He stood very still. "If that is still not enough, say so. I will not trouble you again." She should have answered at once. Instead, the old fear made one final stand. "My father's letter," she said. "It warned against pressure, against pity, against debt." "Yes." "How do I know I am not betraying him by wanting you?" Adrian's face gentled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to lay down all pride between them. "Because he wanted you proud, not lonely. Because he feared a world that would make you bow for survival, and I am asking you not to bow at all." He drew a breath. "And because if he loved you half as fiercely as that letter proves, then he would not call it betrayal for a man to love you with open eyes." Something gave way in her then, not caution entirely, but the last cruel knot of it. She rose. Her knees still felt weak, but not from illness. "I have been so afraid," she said. "I know." "No," she whispered, "not only of being refused, of being cherished for reasons that would vanish in daylight, of waking to find I had been grateful into a life I did not choose." His hand lifted very slowly, giving her all the time in the world to draw back. When his fingers touched her cheek, they were warm and unshaking. "Eleanor," he said, "look at me in daylight then." The little room was dim, but enough light remained from the lamp to show every earnest line of him. She looked. She saw the gravity, the patience worn thin by feeling, the hope he had no skill at hiding where she was concerned. Then, because at some point courage and longing became the same thing, she leaned into his hand. That was all. Only that slight yielding. It transformed him. His eyes closed briefly, and a breath left him like pain relieved. When he opened them again, there was no question in them, only reverence so unguarded it nearly broke her heart anew. "If I kiss you now," he said roughly, "I should like it understood that I have meant to for several lifetimes." A laugh trembled through her tears. "That seems immoderate. I have been moderate for weeks. It has not suited me." She ought to have answered with some equal wit. Instead, she said the truest thing she had ever spoken. Then yes. He kissed her, as if restraint had been teaching him hunger all along. There was nothing hurried in it, nothing claiming or careless. It was worse than hunger. It was recognition given a mouth. His hand remained at her cheek, his other at her waist, steadying rather than taking. Yet the kiss held every unsaid thing between them. The rain, the ballroom, the library, the front steps of Ashbourne, the letter left unanswered, the miles of refusal neither had managed to make convincing. When he drew back, his forehead rested briefly against hers. "That," he said under his breath, "is not duty." She almost smiled. "No, nor pity. No. Thank God," she would have answered, but voices sounded in the other room, and reality returned in a rush. Anne's fever had broken. Mrs. Hales was crying again, this time with joy. Adrian stepped back, not because feeling had lessened, but because the world required its forms. "We will speak properly when you are rested," he said. Properly sounds disappointing now. He gave a soft, astonished huff of laughter. "You see what you do to my judgment." He left an hour later, only because the doctor insisted he could do no more, and because Dawn would invite a scandal too obvious, even for desperation. Before he went, he bent over Anne's sleeping form, tucked the blanket at her shoulder, and looked once back at Eleanor with such steadiness that the room seemed to keep the imprint of him after the door shut. She slept then, deeply and without dreams. By noon, the fever danger had passed. By evening, Eleanor was back at Aunt Lydia's house, carrying in her chest a kind of fragile, blazing certainty no propriety could extinguish. It lasted exactly until she entered the drawing room and found Lady Augusta seated beside Aunt Lydia. Arabella stood by the mantel, pale with fury. On the table lay a newspaper, a calling card, and a folded note sealed in dark green wax. Lady Augusta rose at once. "Miss Vale, I fear matters have accelerated beyond comfort." Eleanor removed her gloves slowly. "What matters?" Aunt Lydia fluttered. "There has been talk. Someone saw His Grace at the Marsh Cottages after dusk. Lady Fenwick has the least governable footman in England. By breakfast, the entire county will think you compromised," Arabella said sharply. "Only because people prefer ugliness if they can make it sound moral." Lady Augusta ignored her. "Adrian has sent a note. He rode to London at dawn on urgent business. Until his return, I advise the greatest discretion." Something cold touched Eleanor's spine. "What urgent business?" Lady Augusta handed her the note. There were only a few lines. "Eleanor, I have gone to London because a matter concerning your father's affairs has reached me too late, and from the wrong quarter. I cannot explain fully until I return, but I ask one thing of you. Trust me for 3 days. Refuse every arrangement made in haste. Burn this if you wish. Only wait." Aonda read it twice. Her first reaction was relief that he wrote at all. Her second was dread. "What matter concerning my father?" she asked. Lady Augusta's expression was unreadable. "I had hoped Adrian would not involve you until facts were settled." "Facts about what?" Aunt Lydia looked away. That was answer enough. Eleanor turned very slowly toward her aunt. "What have you done?" "Done? Really, Eleanor, this melodrama is unworthy. There was confusion after your father died. Debts, letters, settlements. One does what one must." Arabella made an inarticulate sound of disgust. Eleanor stepped closer. "What letters?" Aunt Lydia's color rose. "A gentleman once wrote from Ashbourne's solicitors regarding a small trust your mother had been left by an elderly relation. It was tied up, very inconveniently, and your father had no head for business. I managed matters. Surely you are not accusing me over some old legal dust." A roaring began in Eleanor's ears. "My mother had a trust?" Arabella covered her mouth. Mamma. Aunt Lydia's hand went to her lace collar. A trifling one, and largely consumed by expenses on your behalf, I assure you. Eleanor stared. Pieces fell into place, so fast they seemed to bruise as they landed. The vanished savings, the dependence prolonged, the urgency of a practical marriage, the convenient mislaying of her father's letter. Lady Augusta spoke, but her voice seemed far away. Adrian received word from our London solicitor this morning that the trust was never properly extinguished. There are irregular signatures, Mrs. Harbury. He has gone to examine them. Aunt Lydia rose in alarm. Surely no one means to accuse me of forgery. No one answered at once. Even silence looked condemning now. Arabella faced her mother with tears bright on her cheeks. Did you take her money? I kept this household alive after your uncle's investments failed. I clothed you both, fed you both. With her mother's money? Bella's voice cracked. And then called her expensive. The room seemed too small for such ugliness. Eleanor felt oddly calm. Betrayal, once named, often loses its power to astonish. How much? Aunt Lydia sank back into her chair, as if the question itself indicted her. I do not know, not precisely. Then Adrian does, Lady Augusta said coldly. That shocked Eleanor almost as much as the scandal. Lady Augusta's contempt, though hardly affectionate, was not for Eleanor. It was for theft badly dressed as family necessity. Aunt Lydia began to cry in angry, mortified bursts. Arabella stood rigid and white. Eleanor folded Adrian's note and placed it in her reticule beside her father's letter. 3 days, he had asked. For the first time in her life, waiting felt not passive, but brave. The first day passed in rumor. By noon, neighboring ladies were calling under pretense of concern. By afternoon, one servant had been dismissed for repeating kitchen gossip in the market. Mr. Swithin sent a note of polite withdrawal, citing unforeseen complications. Aunt Lydia called him a coward, and then remembered too late that his retreat ought perhaps to wound Eleanor. It did not. Nothing could compete with the knowledge now uncoiling through the house. Arabella refused to leave her room except to see Eleanor. If he does not return, she said with desperate loyalty, I shall never forgive him. Eleanor touched her sleeve. He will return. How do you know? She thought of a rain-soaked road, a fever cottage, the way he had sat through the night without needing to be seen. Because he finishes what he begins. The second day passed in silence more dangerous than rumor. Aunt Lydia received 2 letters and burned one unread after recognizing the solicitor's seal. Lady Augusta remained, installed like grim justice in plum silk, accepting no excuses and giving none. At supper she said, with unnerving bluntness, I misjudged you, Miss Vale. I had thought my nephew susceptible to a generous impulse, dressed as feeling. It appears he is simply in love. Eleanor nearly dropped her glass. Lady Augusta sipped wine. Do not look so astonished. He has been impossible for weeks. It was perhaps the closest the lady had ever come to a blessing. On the 3rd afternoon a carriage stopped at the gate. Not Adrian's. The Ashbourne solicitors, 2 stern men in dark coats entered with document cases and expressions suggesting they had long been waiting for moral vindication through paperwork. What followed was not dramatic in the manner of novels. No one shouted, no one fainted. That made it harsher. Sheets of figures were laid out, signatures compared, dates checked against bank transfers and parish notices. A trust of £2,000, left by Marianne Vale's godmother for the education and independence of her daughter, had indeed existed. After Marianne's death, control had passed temporarily to her husband, then by power of management, never ownership, to Lydia Harbury during his final illness. Portions had been withdrawn lawfully for school fees and household costs. Much more had vanished through fabricated accounts and altered endorsements over 2 years. Aunt Lydia called it misunderstanding. The solicitors called it misappropriation. Eleanor sat straight back through every explanation, hands in her lap, while years of quiet diminishment arranged themselves into deliberate theft. Arabella wept silently in the corner. Lady Augusta's face was carved from displeasure. Then the front door opened below. Footsteps crossed the hall. Eleanor knew before seeing him. Adrian came in carrying cold air and exhaustion like twin shadows. He looked as though he had ridden half the distance home, rather than endured a slower pace. Dust marked his coat. His eyes found Eleanor at once. That was enough. She could breathe again. He greeted the solicitors, heard the last summary in silence, and then turned to Aunt Lydia. "You will leave this house by Monday," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Aunt Lydia stared. "You cannot dictate." "I can and do. The house is leased in my name, pending settlement of Vale matters, something your brother-in-law apparently neglected to explain before his death. I have allowed your occupancy out of regard for family connection. That regard is exhausted." Arabella looked up, stunned. Eleanor did too. Adrian continued with terrible calm. "The sums taken from Miss Vale's trust will be restored in full from your remaining assets and by sale of the Bath property if required. If you contest this, I will pursue criminal charges. If you comply, I will refrain for Arabella's sake." At Bella's name, Aunt Lydia crumpled into furious tears. "You would ruin us for that girl?" Adrian's face changed then, and Eleanor saw the full steel beneath all his tenderness. "No," he said. "You nearly ruined yourself for want of decency. I am merely arriving in time to stop you taking her with you." The room was utterly still. At last Lady Augusta rose. "I believe the legal portion is concluded. Mrs. Harbury, you may take your grievances upstairs and compose them for private use." It was the most merciless dismissal Eleanor had ever seen. Aunt Lydia, shaking, allowed herself to be led away by a maid who looked scandalized to be touching her. When the door shut, the remaining silence felt strange and fragile, as if the house itself had not expected justice to arrive in so plain a coat. Arabella crossed at once to Adrian. "Thank you," she whispered, and left before emotion overcame her. Lady Augusta gathered her gloves. She looked from Adrian to Eleanor and back again. "I shall walk in the garden," she said. "For 1 full quarter hour, I will discover an unexpected fondness for air." Then she too was gone. Eleanor and Adrian stood alone among papers proving what love had always feared, that she had not merely been poor, but wronged. He took one step toward her. "Are you well?" The question, after all that, undid her more than any grander speech might have done. "No," she said truthfully, "but I think I might become so." Relief and grief crossed his face together. He came nearer. "I should have seen sooner," he said. "I should have examined the accounts when your father died. I trusted people I despised too little to watch, and too much to stop. This is not your fault. It became my responsibility the instant your name entered my house." His voice roughened. "And I let you stand there believing yourself a burden while others spent what should have protected you." She shook her head. "Do not make my injuries another form of your guilt." That halted him. Some painful tenderness entered his eyes. "You see?" he said softly. "This is why I have not a scrap of defense left. Even now you are trying to save my soul from vanity." A broken laugh escaped her. He reached into his coat and drew out a sealed packet. "These are the restored trust documents, once the final transfers are complete. Your mother's money, your father's name cleared of incompetence, and one more thing." From the same inner pocket he took a small velvet case. Her pulse stuttered. "I had meant," he said, not quite smiling, "to do this under less legal supervision." He opened the case. Inside lay a ring, unlike the ostentatious jewels society admired. It was old, oval, a deep blue sapphire ringed by small pearls. Under the afternoon light, the stone looked almost the precise shade of her mother's gown. "It belonged to my mother," Adrian said. "She wore it when she first came to Ashbourne as a bride, and wrote to yours that houses need not win if women refuse to surrender themselves entirely." His gaze lifted to Eleanor's. "I have no right to ask anything while you are shaken, so I will ask the only honest question I can manage." He drew breath. "Now that debt, pressure, false guardianship, and every practical prison have been dragged into daylight, will you choose me freely? Tears filled her eyes so suddenly she could not hide them. You waited, she whispered. Yes. You could have pressed. Yes. You came anyway. I will always come anyway. There are moments when happiness does not feel like rising, but like being recognized at last by one's own life. Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had seen her in rain and candlelight and sick rooms and disgrace, who had looked at her worn gown and found not poverty but memory, who had offered not rescue but regard, so fierce it left no room for condescension, and knew that love had ceased to be the dangerous thing. Fear was. She held out her hand. Yes, she said, freely, entirely, and with more terror than dignity. He let out a breath that sounded like the first honest one he had taken in days. Terror, I can manage. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though his mother's hand had been waiting through years and losses for this exact answer. Then he looked at her, as if asking once more without words. She crossed the final inch between them herself. His arms came around her with a tenderness that did not weaken the strength of him. He kissed her hair first, as though reverence had not yet learned haste, and then her mouth, this time with nothing restrained except the joy that would have frightened the whole house if permitted to show at once. When he drew back, she was laughing through tears. Lady Augusta will be insufferable. She will claim credit. She may even deserve some. He glanced toward the garden door. Let us never say so aloud. Their engagement traveled through the county with the speed reserved for any event in which romance humiliates calculation. Lady Viola left for London within 2 days, citing a prior invitation no one believed had suddenly become irresistible. Mr. Swithin married a capable widow in spring and was, according to rumour, much happier with someone who liked hinges. Aunt Lydia removed to Bath in diminished circumstances, where she discovered that people receive faded gentility more coldly when accompanied by public suspicion. Arabella, with part of her own small settlement safeguarded by Adrian before her mother could reach it, came often to Ashbourne and learned that kindness and beauty need not be rivals if both are made to work. As for Lady Augusta, she astonished everyone by becoming almost affectionate, in a manner so dry it might have been mistaken for weather. On the morning she formally gave Eleanor a set of family lace, she said, "You have improved my nephew's temper, the household's moral architecture, and the quality of breakfast conversation. I suppose this obliges me to value you." Eleanor, wiser now, answered, "I shall treasure such warmth all my life." Lady Augusta nearly smiled. The wedding took place at the small chapel on the Ashbourne estate in late winter, when frost still silvered the hedges, but the first snowdrops had begun to gather in the orchard. Adrian wanted London, then decided he hated the idea. Eleanor wanted simplicity, then discovered that simplicity at Ashbourne still involved 80 guests and 3 footmen devoted exclusively to flowers. In the end they compromised, which Lady Augusta declared an encouraging sign for matrimony. On the morning of the wedding, Mrs. Brindle entered Eleanor's chamber, carrying a large box. "For after," she said with a mysterious air. Eleanor opened it and found the silver-blue gown restored. The worn silk had been lined from within by expert hands, so that the old softness remained, but the weak seams no longer threatened. The lace had been cleaned and reset. The frayed cuff was strengthened invisibly, preserving even the little imperfection she had loved, because her mother's fingers had once touched it there. It was not transformed into fashion, it was honored into continuance. Beneath it lay a note in Adrian's hand. "I thought your mother's gown ought to live in a house where no one will ever again mistake what it means." She stood very still, holding the paper, while tears blurred the ink. She was married in cream silk and family lace, with the sapphire ring dark against her glove. But that evening, after dinner, after toasts, after Lady Augusta's formidable speech about perseverance disguised as propriety, Eleanor changed into the restored silver-blue gown. When she entered the smaller drawing-room where the last of the intimate guests had gathered, conversation faltered. Arabella gasped. Mrs. Brindle cried openly. Even Lady Augusta looked once at the ceiling, as if to discourage herself from sentiment. Adrian, standing by the fire with a glass in his hand, turned. The expression on his face was the same one he had worn the first night she wore it at Ashbourne. Not surprise, not appreciation, but recognition so complete it seemed to gather every intervening sorrow and make sense of it. He came toward her, slow enough to let the room see and quick enough to prove it had ceased to matter. "You should know," he said softly when he reached her, "that I am about to behave like an idiotic bridegroom and forget everyone else exists. I hoped marriage might improve your discipline. It has ruined it." He touched the sleeve just where the old cuff had once shown. "You kept it. You restored it." "No." His eyes held hers with quiet intensity. "You did that the first night you wore it here. The rest was only stitching." She laughed, and because she was his wife now, and had a right to every tenderness she had once feared, she laid her hand over his. "Do you still think no lady in London could look finer?" He looked at her as though the answer were almost insulting in its obviousness. "Eleanor," he said, "I told the truth too mildly. There has never been a room in which you were not the most beautiful thing once I had seen you." No one had heard, except perhaps Arabella, who turned away smiling through tears. That was well. Some sentences belong not to society, but to the life built after surviving it. Spring came early to Ashbourne that year. The rose walk greened. Lambs appeared in the lower meadow. Eleanor took over the school accounts so efficiently that even the clerk came to admire her. She arranged books in the window-seat room Adrian had shown her, filling the high shelves slowly with her father's volumes, her mother's letters, estate histories, poetry, and the absurdly sentimental gift of a French novel Bella swore every married woman ought to hide from clergymen. She learned where the morning light fell best in the library, and which tenants needed direct help instead of lectures. She discovered Adrian was impossible when overworked, silent when troubled, and easier to love in domestic hours than in dramatic ones, which felt like a miracle, because dramatic hours had already been difficult to survive. He, for his part, learned that her temper appeared rarely but with devastating precision, that she could read estate fraud faster than his steward, and that, if he returned from a long ride chilled and thoughtful, she would not press him until he was ready, only place tea near his elbow, and wait with such companionable steadiness that he often confessed everything simply to earn the right to keep her looking at him. Once in early May, they passed through the long gallery together and stopped before the portrait of his mother in pale blue silk. Eleanor stood quietly a moment. "I think," she said, "she would be amused by us." Adrian's hand found hers. "Because we are happy? Because we behaved like tragic fools for a month before discovering the obvious." He considered. "My mother valued both happiness and dramatic irony. You may be right." Eleanor leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. Sunlight lay warm across the floorboards. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked after a while. "The trouble, the scandal, the defiance." He turned to her at once, brows drawing together, as if the notion itself were offensive. "Do I regret rain because it led you to my road? Do I regret a gown because it taught a room to be ashamed of itself? Do I regret discovering that every sensible arrangement in my life was worth less than one impossible woman telling me the truth?" He bent and kissed her temple. "No, I regret only the hours before I knew you would stay." She smiled. "I nearly did not. I know." His hand tightened on hers. "That is why I shall never again treat your presence as inevitable." The words settled deep, not dramatic, only faithful. She thought perhaps that was what made them so beautiful. In summer, when the roses were full, Arabella visited for a fortnight. One evening she found Eleanor in the west garden, wearing the restored blue gown because the air was warm, and Adrian had a weakness for seeing it where sunlight could touch the silk. "You know," Bella said, dropping onto the bench beside her, "Mamma still insists men are bewitched by novelty." Eleanor looked up from the pruning shears in her hand. "And what do you think?" Arabella watched as Adrian crossed the lawn toward them, his black dog racing ahead, and his face already changing at the sight of his wife. "I think," Bella said softly, "some men are saved by recognition." Eleanor followed her gaze. Adrian reached them, took the shears from her hand because he distrusted her near thorns when distracted, and looked at the gown, at her face, at the roses around them. "There you are," he said, with the simple daily wonder of a man who had not yet grown used to finding happiness waiting where he most hoped for it. "There you are. Not a claim, not a relief sharpened by fear, just the language of a home finally inhabited." Years later, when people told the story badly, they spoke first of the Duke and the worn gown, of the ballroom hush, of the astonishing match, of the aunt disgraced and the fortune restored. Society always prefers its romances in visible symbols, but the truth lived elsewhere. It lived in a rain-soaked road where a frightened woman told the truth to a stranger because she thought he had no power over her. It lived in a library where old letters proved that memory could be a dowry finer than diamonds. It lived in a ballroom where a powerful man looked at a faded inheritance and saw, not embarrassment, but beauty no glittering lady could rival. It lived in a fever cottage where love arrived without summons and sat still enough for a child to sleep. And it lived, most faithfully of all, in the years that followed, when no audience remained to be impressed, and yet Adrian St. Clair, Duke of Ashbourne, never once looked at his wife as if wonder had become ordinary. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Eleanor would wear her mother's restored gown and stand at the long window in the west drawing room while dusk gathered over the lawns. Adrian would come in from his work, pause at the threshold, and still, after all the seasons between, lose that next heartbeat exactly as he had the first time. Then he would cross to her, touch the old blue silk at her sleeve, and say in the low voice that belonged only to them, "I was right in the beginning." And when she asked, though she always knew, about what, he would answer, every time, as though no truth in his life had ever been easier or more worth repeating, that no lady alive was half so beautiful.